नहीं होते तो इस्लाम के एड्रेस में बैठे हुए तो एड्रेस वो क्लियर कर देना पर्सनली रजिस्टर कर रहा है तो ये फार्म नहीं है जाके उन्होंने जबानी पुछना की एड्रेस है ये कागज पे जो लिखा है उन्होंने पैसे देखने होते हैं Oh, you all right?
Yeah, thanks.
Long day.
Same spots, huh?
Yeah, the same.
What is that?
I don't know.
What, second time somebody said?
You can say yes if you want. Before. Only nothing. तो उन्होंने वो भी लेनी है यहाँ पे फिर आपने भी लड़ी देगी स्पॉट मेंबरशिप दे दे मतलब सेशन मेंबरशिप उनको इधर करना देना these are the kind of एक भी दे दी है फिर दूसरे में कर देंगे
Sessions ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਣ ਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਰੋਕ
एक वो भी पैसे भेजे होंगे उनको जिस पे VIP का रिकॉर्ड दे देना VIP का रिकॉर्ड
Are you serious?
You didn't know Dick?
I got some email. Like,
ਖਾਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਫੋਟੋ ਚੈਨਲ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ So will you be able to accompany me over the trip?
Yes. Yeah, it's okay.
Prices exactly we have. And it's like 5-star network. Monday having reservation last year. How much money?
You could in the end of the day get us to register 24 hours after now, once you can
We told her, so it's a initial training, then let us say go. This is how it is. So that
ask a 5-star and this. We have to offer some similar. They can't just operate on their own. If they're charging money, like they're charging employees in their
okay, another people use the spouse in the mind. ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਜਿਸਟ ਰੋਟੀ ਇਹ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਟਿਕਟ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹਾਂ ਵੇਚ ਦਿਓ ਪਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੋਈ ਬਸ ਉਹੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਮੇਟੀ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਬਣਾਈ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਉਹੀ ਹੈ
I'm absolutely exhausted. Okay.
Is that your seat?
No. It's all my stuff, sorry.
Oh,
Most
I brought my gym stuff with me, or not my gym, my soccer stuff with me, because I've got a match at 9:30, but I reckon I'll just stay here.
I've
after
just
the
been here
talk.
since I had this I went to know you social things.
Really?
So what is that side of my USU? John Edwards was speaking.
Around the clouds.
He's got years back.
January 25th to December, then we go.
And he's talking about work getting at 37 million of getting property and how we've got it. John Edwards, he's John Kerry's so he was the vice president with Kerry.
I'll be back out.
Yes, well, it's not a lie. It's true.
I'll see you there.
So I get out my little notepad. I need a notepad. Like,
Buy a book,
I
I'll send you
need
that.
to put these things in. And then we send it back. There are people who are poor. They're not rich. And then he says,
The talk yesterday was
bad things happen to good people.
it was like, what's the point of excluding 50% of the population just because they have bumps on their chest? He's just kind of really funny.
It's hilarious. And when he says,
Ross. You know what screen's off? Welcome.
I think that's good.
Right.
All right, I guess the first question is my mic on? Okay, I'm going to assume that was a yes. Huh? Yes, now it is. Okay, that's better, thank you. Good evening, welcome to the forum at Harvard University. I'm Barbara Bodine, and I'm the director of the Governance Initiative in the Middle East at the Belfer Center. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Governance Initiative and the Institute of Politics. And our theme tonight is the clash of misperceptions, the U.S. and the Middle East since 9/11. After 9/11, many Americans asked, why do they hate us? They were not quite clear who they were, but they believed and feared that whoever they were implacably hostile and bent on destroying us. It was perhaps an understandable reaction to 9/11, But to those who had lived and worked in the Middle East for so much of our careers, we did not accept this ready assumption of a monolithic antipathy towards us as Americans or America as a country. It was true and no secret that some of our policies and actions in the world are strongly opposed, but even in the most heated debates, our interlocutors took pains to distinguish between the people and the country on the one hand and a set of policies on the other. And the distinction, I believe, was sincere and not just mere politeness. The rhetoric on our side often paints a picture of an inevitable clash of civilizations based on inherently incompatible philosophies, values, and goals. They, which has never been clearly defined, hate our freedom and quote what we stand for. On the other side of the divide is a growing conviction that we are implacably hostile to their religion, their culture, and what they believe they stand for. There is an increasing number of reports that the distinction between support for what America stands for and opposition to what America does may be narrowing. And the question is arising whether our actions, in fact, are an accurate reflection of who we are. What we have done is that, as we always do, we have established any number of commissions and committees with any number of reports and strategies across the US government and across the political spectrum, including a number of think tanks. There's been the Defense Science Board, the US Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, the Council on Foreign Relations, the General Accounting Office. I don't know what they were doing. Both the Heritage Foundation and Brookings. Somewhere in there is a report called Changing Minds and Winning Peace, which two of our guests tonight were a part of, which was mandated by the House and looked at the nature of our public diplomacy problem, and also included some detailed and extensive recommendations. While we studied and debated who they were and why or if and how much they might have hated us, and perhaps why and how much they thought we hated them, the Department of State, which is the lead agency, has gone through 3 undersecretaries for public diplomacy and 1 after a very lengthy interregnum. I'm sure that everyone in this room knows that Karen Hughes, who describes herself as a working mom from Texas, is our new undersecretary. It is a fair assumption that given her proven considerable political skills and her relationship to the president, public diplomacy will move much higher on the list of priorities, both at the State Department and the White House. But I think we can talk about the successes or not of her first trip. The question is it a misperception, or are there fundamental differences that cannot be bridged but at least can be accepted? Has the nature of the problem shifted from a debate on policy to a debate on values? How much of this is fed by the media and escalating default to 2-dimensional stereotypes on both sides? And finally, what can be done that is reasonable, practical, and effective to narrow what a speaker at another conference I attended called a clash of ignorance? Our panel tonight includes, from my left, John Zogby, who is the president and CEO of Zogby International, one of the most accurate and well-respected pollster organizations in the US today. Zogby alone correctly called the 1996 presidential election. He has polled for every major media outlet, television station, and newspapers large and small across the United States, as well as Canada and Mexico, Israel, and Iran. His high point of his career, though, and something that the rest of us can only aspire to, was his appearance on October 28, 2004 on The Daily Show. He has provided extensive and accurate data on policy and perceptions in the Middle East and served on a number of commissions. This year, he has also agreed to be the non-resident special advisor to the Governance Initiative, which I'm very pleased. Dr. Shibli Tahami is well-known and very respected scholar on the Middle East. His current projects include the role of the media in shaping political identity, public opinion, and American foreign policy. He too has served on a number of these commissions and is a frequent commentator in the media, as well as a visiting lecturer at a number of the best universities in this country. He was also very kind to be a guest speaker as part of my study group last fall at the IOP. Dr. Telhami is a non-resident scholar, senior fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings, and the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development, University of Maryland. Dr. Jafar Hassan is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Jordan. And we're sitting in a different order than I wrote my notes. My apologies, I just looked up. I think you can tell which one is Jafar. He is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Jordan in Washington, as well as an Edward Mason Fellow at the MC-MPP program here. He served as the director of the Israel section, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's been at the Jordanian mission to the UN headquarters in Geneva, and he was seconded to the director of National Security Council at the Royal Palace. He has a PhD and a master's from the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, and is an alumni of Boston University and American University in Paris. And finally, Ms. Bina Sarwar is a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, and on leave from her work this year from being the op-ed and features editor with the News International in Karachi. She earned her BA at Brown University, so we have a very strong Boston contingent here today, and a master's in television documentary at the University of London. Her journalistic career began as an intern and has gone all the way up to being a senior editor. She has made several documentaries and contributed chapters on books focusing on South Asia and women's issues. Our format tonight is going to be a brief presentation by Mr. Zogby, sharing with us some of his data. And then I'm going to turn it over to a living room style discussion amongst all of us. After about half an hour, we're going to open it up for questions and answers from the floor. So with that, I will turn it over to John.
Great, thank you, Barbara. Is my mic on? Yes.
Okay.
And you are going to watch it up there, and I am going to try to watch it over here.
Wow.
No, I'm not. We're going to do this. Okay. I'm going to watch it the same as you. I have about 4 minutes and 22 seconds left, I'm told, so I'm going to be very brief. Do they hate us? Let's begin by not casting things in terms of we and they. Planet is filled with us. There is no clash of civilizations. And as we discovered in our first round of polling after 9/11, polling in the Arab world and among some non-Arab Muslim nations, they certainly liked various aspects of America, American society, American culture, and so on. They hated our policy. No surprise there. They hated our policy towards the Arab nations. They hated our policy towards Palestine. They hated our policy towards Islamic nations. They were very clear on that. We have gone back since 2002 4 times and tested public opinion to see if there have been any changes, but I have a few minutes I want to share with you some of the highlights from the last poll that we did, and we did some of this in conjunction with my friend Shibley, and in fact we're in the field right now in 6 countries as we speak. What I wanted to do in this round was not only ask about various aspects. There you see American science and technology, American movies and television, the American people, and so on. But what I wanted to do is get some cross-tabulated data. And so we asked a series of questions in our demographics section. Have you visited the United States? Would you like to visit the United States? Do you have friends or family who have visited? Do you know any Americans? Would you like to know more about the United States? Would you like to meet Americans? And we cross-tabulated this data against what we found in our 2004 survey. What you see, I think, is very important for our discussion of public diplomacy. In each case, when respondents, and this is now 3,300 respondents in 6 Arab countries, those who answered yes to any of those questions versus those who answered no to any of those questions, look at the large differential. 84% of those who had visited the United States were favorable to American science and technology. Only 68% of those who said that they had not visited the US. But look at all across the board, those who answered yes to any of those variables were considerably higher than those who answered no. American freedom and democracy. Here, the same sort of thing, but this question in particular was extremely important because while the president did some very good things in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, one of the things he said was that they hate us for our freedom and democracy. And what we discovered was really quite the contrary. But look at now the differential between those who had visited the U.S. and those who had not visited the U.S. and their favorability towards American freedom and democracy. Even those who would like to visit versus those who would not like to visit. Friends or family who have visited, in each case there is a wide differential in perception. How about the American people? Again, from those who actually visited the United States, a 26-point difference in favorability over those who had not. And then you have considerable differences all across the board. Sorry this has to be so brief, but we can make this available to you if you'd like to see the entire PowerPoint. Like to visit the U.S., 22-point differential. Even friends or family who have visited the United States, 24-point differential. American-made products, the same sort of variation. The American education system, American freedom and opportunity and its importance. 20-point differential between those who had visited, those who have not, those who would like to visit, and those who would not, and so on down the line. I don't have much time to go through all of this, but let me just sum things up by saying policy is very important to our public diplomacy. There is no discussion of real public diplomacy unless we get at the core of what bothers Arabs and bothers Muslims, and that is our policy towards Palestine, our policy in Iraq, and so on. However, in the midst of all of that, global bridging of some sort is absolutely essential. And one of the things that we're doing now in the limitation of work visas, the limitation of student visas, is we're biting our nose to spite our face. Thanks.
Thank you. Would you like to make some comments, since I know you've been doing some shared polling? And then we'll open it up for a discussion.
Well, just to put it in perspective, I have been designing polls in the Arab world over the past few years, in large part to see whether this new media phenomenon, the satellite television, has had impact on the way people see the world, and particularly on notions of identity. How do they see themselves now, assuming that the whole environment of media has changed? And in the process, I ask a lot of questions. And so my polling, in conjunction with Zogby International in 6 Arab countries, has been in part about opinion, but even more about whether there's a relationship between that opinion and what they see on the media. And I would say, if you were to ask me, what are the 2 most striking findings over the past few years, I'll give you 2. The first is not that people have very unfavorable views of the U.S. That's not all that new. I mean, I think the magnitude is new. We've certainly reached a low point in terms of the favorable view of the U.S. in the Arab world. And frankly, it's not limited to the Arab and Muslim world, because we see in the global polls the attitudes toward the U.S. have gone down significantly over the past few years. So in that sense, the Arab and Muslim countries are different in magnitude. But the single most important troubling aspect of opinion, as I see it, is what I call collapse in confidence. I think there's a little bit of a difference between not liking a policy and not having a confidence in the agent of that policy. It's a big difference, because in the end, I think people expect that there will be differences of policies, differences of interests, and sometimes they think they can work it out if they have confidence. I think at the moment what we see is, based on the polls, beginning actually with State Department polls that were done from 2000 through 2001, a collapse in confidence that began with the collapse of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations and collapsed further after 9/11. That collapse is troubling, and we find it in the polling, particularly when we have questions about what are America's intentions in the Middle East. So when we ask a question, as we did in the 2004 poll, do you believe that the United States is in Iraq to spread democracy in the region? Majorities say no. Do you believe that the U.S. is in Iraq to spread Middle East peace and human rights? Majorities say no. And so when you ask them, therefore, about what our stated intentions, they don't have faith that we mean what we say. When you ask them, therefore, what is driving American policy in the Middle East, some of the answers are not surprising. Some of them are extremely troubling. And I'll tell you what I mean here. Not surprisingly, two of the three most important variables are oil and Israel. Clearly, people believe that America is in Iraq for oil or to help Israel. That's common. That's not new anyway. In some ways, it's not new to our academy because we've taught American foreign policy historically to say what motivates America in the Middle East is primarily oil and Israel and maybe containment of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. That was the analytical perspective. And people don't like that, of course, and they've always thought America was biased on those issues, but they've come to deal with them. They understand that America as a superpower has an interest in oil, and they have to deal with it. What's troubling is, in addition to those, you have almost the same ranking, an answer which says America is seeking to weaken the Muslim world. If you start believing that America has the intent, an anti-Islamic intent, then you can't bridge that gap. And we see that in conjunction with what seems to be an increasing Islamic identity. We don't have much of a timeline on that. We're repeating that question at the moment, and we're pursuing in the current survey, the results of which we should have in November, should tell us a little bit more about it. But those are the troubling issues, I think, the collapse in confidence and the sense that America is out there to weaken the Muslim world, even aside from its strategic interests.
Any comments? Go ahead.
Well, I would take up where Shibli had left on the issue of intentions. And I think for Arab officials, it is a problem as much as it is a problem for the US in terms of bridging this gap between what our public perceives and where our shared interests, strategic interests, lay with the United States. Ironically, we're at a time where we have more strategic interests in common with the US than before. The issues at stake do relate to our critical needs more than ever before. Yet, among our public, we see this total divide. So how do you bridge this divide between state and public that at the end of the day is so critical for both the US and the Arab countries? It is unfortunate that strategy is often made in isolation from the public. We go to war, we sign peace treaties, we establish relations, and we decide all kinds of strategic decisions without really the level of transparency and the level of inclusion that is needed to make any major move by any government sustainable and supported by its own public. Bringing the US-Arab strategic relations out in the open and making them more transparent and involving the public in understanding where these shared strategic communalities lay are essential in making people understand where these common interests are, and perhaps having more light on the intentions, and maybe also understanding that Arab regimes are not coalescing against their public's interests for the sake of US objectives and interests. These are shared strategic interests that do address the Arab public's concern. As long as we don't highlight this and we keep it within the context of generalities like freedom, democracy, and war on ideas that are not even defined, then the suspicions and the lack of confidence is very justified.
We've made a couple of comments about the role of the media. As the media representative, do you want to either add or rebut what we have been saying? What do you see as the media's role in either bridging some of these gaps or in some cases maybe even exacerbating them?
Well, I think that in both cases, the media plays a role in bridging the gap as well as in exacerbating it. And I think part of the reason is that the media, what we call the nature of the beast, is to focus on the events. So we focus on events, and as they say, no news is good news. So if it's good news, it's not going to be highlighted. Positive things, processes, perceptions. I mean, media, especially now with the age of television more and more, and the quick sound bites, 30-second sound bites, I think especially since you see this with satellite television all over the world, media tends not to go so much into in depth at the bottom of what is at the heart of the issue, what's really behind what's going on, what's behind the events. And I think that does exacerbate the negative sides of everything, and I think it contributes to the stereotypes and the misperceptions. I think if you talk to people one-to-one and get behind the scenes a little bit, you get a very different idea. And as your poll shows, that the reality out there is very different from what the media, what we get from the media. If you just look at newspapers and television, you think that everybody hates everybody else. And that's not really the case. I mean, I find, people relate to people in a very different way. And I think the other point that was very important in your poll, which again somehow doesn't really come out in the media so much, and maybe that's more now with this age of the quick, soundbite sort of thing, is the importance of personal contact. That people who have friends in the States, or who have visited the States, or who have lived in the States, or who have relatives here, have a softer view than people who have no contact at all. And unfortunately, with the policies that we've seen in place since what's been come to be called 9/11, has restricted the contacts, the visa restrictions. I mean, the kind of ordeal you have to go through to get an American visa. I mean, I know people like my father, for example, refuse to, he says, I'm not going to even go to the embassy because you don't want to risk the humiliation. And that's what's happening all over the world. And I think it's very correct what one of the panelists said, that it's not just the Arab and the Muslim world. This is all over the world these perceptions are shaping up. And I think the media could play a role, yes. But the media also is a reflector. We can't shape policy. The media is reporting on the policies, could report more responsibly and in more depth with more nuanced kind of, in a more nuanced kind of a way. But what has to change is how the policies are being formulated, not just in the United States, but in our countries as well. And I just want to make one very quick point here about the fact that this is a thing about the Middle East. And I just want to say that Pakistan is not really part of the Middle East. And we've been Middle Easternized, which actually is part of the problem in our country. I think we're part of South Asia, but we're being lumped with the Middle East. No, nothing against the Middle East.
You are most welcome.
Well, I have to, first of all, I was not lumping Pakistan in
No, I'm not saying that you were. I'm just saying that this is just a point I wanted to make is that's again one of the what's happened and how things have shaped up.
The greater Middle East.
Yes, we have.
Or the broader Middle East, or any number of other terms that we have now come up with. But I think there's two questions sitting there. How much of this is fundamentally policy differences, or even a sense that we have different strategic interests, or we don't? And how much of it is the way we're kind of projecting ourselves in terms of being unwelcoming, which you were talking about, going to the embassies and the fear of being humiliated, even if that's not the reality, that's the perception of what's going to happen. If you read any of those reports that I mentioned, including Changing Minds, Winning Peace, it makes a very strong point that whatever our policies and whatever our shared interests, strategic and otherwise might be, we have retreated so much in terms of our presence that we have almost no way of engaging in the dialogue. If a major part of the difference in those bars is whether or not you basically met an American and you have some familiarity, how much of what we're doing is our presentation and can therefore be fixed with presentation, and how much of it is policy and has to be at least more reflecting of intent and comfort, if not content.
Can I answer that quickly through some facts that we have?
Facts are nice.
I think, when you say, is it the concepts, we have Saddam Hussein on trial. When you look at what is the case now against him, given that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and there were none of the things that we said initially were the reasons why we're going in, it boils down ultimately to one case that should resonate with the public, and that is human rights violations against his own people. So our case rests on human rights. The trial started yesterday. Today we have a revelation of our military possibly burning 2 Taliban dead and using it to humiliate additional Taliban. This is one of many previous revelations pertaining to Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib prison. That's not just a perception. Let me tell you why it's not just a perception. Because I did a survey here in America, and I asked people whether they believed our explanation for Guantanamo, whether they believed that this was an isolated incident or a series of isolated incidents. More people believed that it wasn't. More people disbelieved than believed. Our own government story here in America. I polled Arab Americans who are not watching the Arab media on issues related to American foreign policy. And I asked them, what do you watch? We went with Zogby on this, where he had a particular Arab American only segment. And we asked them what they watched for news. They watched American media, including, yes, Fox Television. That is one of their primary sources of news in America. Then we asked them about their opinions of American foreign policy in the Middle East. And they were very much similar to the opinions of people outside in the Middle East and in Europe.
There you go.
Okay, there. All right, we're back online. Please don't do that again. Go ahead. Whatever you said, don't say it again.
Don't say it again. What I'm suggesting is, yes, there is some misperception, and yes, we can do more, and there's a lot we can do, and the interactions, the sort of things that John was talking about, all of the commissions, including ones, 2 that I served on, recommending them, more interaction is better and clearly would reduce that. But it reduces what is probably 10 to 20% of the problem. In the end, policies are the core issues of contention. We have to come to grips with that.
I just want to add to the policy issue. I'm not really sure where it stops being policy and becomes presentation because, for example, just to take that very small anecdotal evidence of the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad, where I believe that now a lot of the people who are the personnel there are no longer from the diplomatic corps, but from the security of. So, and then how they deal with the public is very different.
Yeah, and I do know that our security presences at embassies has gone up considerably. I'm not sure they actually outnumber diplomats now, but the perception that we are armed forts instead of, that we're holding ourselves inward rather than reaching outward is the perception, and that's 9/10 of the reality. You wanted to add something?
There are 3 major benchmarks in American policy since 9/11. I talked about this afternoon. Number one was the embrace by this administration of Ariel Sharon, calling Sharon a man of peace. The second was the drumbeat to war and then going to war. And the third, of course, was Abu Ghraib. All of this lent credence to the growing view among Arabs and Muslims that America was an imperial and colonial power. When this administration then shifted into high gear and acted in contempt of Arab public opinion, it lent even more credence. So the presentation and the policy intersected with each other. So now, Karen Hughes has this wonderful job of undoing the presentation part while the policy stays intact. I have become convinced, sitting on couple of the panels with Shibli, that the presentation part is important. When I first sat on the Advisory Commission for Public Diplomacy, I really thought it was an exercise in futility. But I have at least come to the view that we've got to undo at least some of the most egregious examples of contempt for Arab and Islamic public opinion that we've been showing. And so it's important that we have a visible presence in our embassies. It's important we have American libraries. It's important that we have cultural attachés. It's important that Karen Hughes goes on a listening tour. That could be interpreted maybe as a sign of humility. If we want to talk about communications back and forth, communications does mean listening too, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. It's a two-way.
It is a two-way street. But I still remain skeptical that while there can be important but still cosmetic changes in our presentation, it all comes down to American policy. And American policy right now is hurting.
It's definitely a question of policy, but I don't see that policy needs to be changed as much as it needs to be acted on where it is necessary to be acted on. Four issues that the Arab public blames directly or indirectly the US for: insecurity in the region, lack of opportunities, helplessness, and hopelessness. The US has to recognize that the Arabs feel that there is a big injustice. Recognizing that the injustices that they believe the US is responsible for, maybe indirectly, and recognizing that these situations should be changed is vital. The other vital element is giving an alternative. What is the US going to do to improve the situation in the Middle East and help with some of the grievances? The US has to give a credible alternative because the Arab public is very sophisticated politically. Advertising is not public diplomacy.
Yeah.
There has to be concrete, and there is the confidence problem again. So this makes it even more difficult to prove to the Arab public that there is a serious intention in addressing their concerns and addressing these four major problems. But the objectives are there. Whether you look at the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or the situation in Iraq, the problem is not in the objectives, but the problem is that the people don't see the US doing what is necessary to achieve these objectives. The policy on Palestine, having a Palestinian state, final status negotiations, there are problems regarding settlements in the sense that this administration says, stop settlements. The president comes out and says, settlements need to stop. But there is no action that is visible to the public that shows that this administration is really following on, even on policy. Perhaps more should be put out in terms of what this administration is doing, and to make the public feel that there is some truth to the rhetoric. Otherwise, the confidence gap will only increase.
Yeah, I think there's one more aspect to this, which is that a lot of the peoples of the Middle East and of other countries live in societies that are not democratic. And that is not directly the fault of the United States.
Right.
But the United States has been supporting dictatorships and non-democratic regimes. I mean, in Pakistan, for example, I think there's a lot of bitterness in the public mind about the United States support first of General Zia for 12 years, which totally took us back, and introduced sectarianism and the Kalashnikov culture and all that, for the strategic reasons that we were allied with the United States in the war against in Afghanistan. Right. And then now they're supporting General Musharraf, who also took over power in a coup. So they're seen as a huge sort of double standards that, you're talking about democracy, but you're supporting non-democratic governments. And then I think there's also the perception that, okay, there's a lot of talk about democracy and, bringing democracy to the world, but, are you the world's policeman? Do you need, who asked you to bring democracy to the world? First, bring democracy to the United States. I think that's what a lot of people back home think.
But you've highlighted one of these almost conundrums that we hear a lot when we're trying to deal with the rest of the world. And I'm kind of slipping back to my old job. Is on the one hand, where the administration in the U.S. Is criticized for supporting democracies. Supporting dictatorships and not doing enough to change and make manifest our values. And then on the other side, we get criticized because we're trying to bring democracy, and this is an interference in. But I've heard this on one hand. Your role is to go out and get rid of the dictators, and on the other one, don't interfere in our internal affairs.
No, I don't think I was saying to go out and get rid of the dictator. I think it was more like don't support them. There's a difference between going in there and trying to actively get rid of a dictator, and there's a difference between not supporting a dictatorial regime with, military alliances and weapons and so on and so forth.
I think Jaffa brings up, I think, another point that we can discuss briefly before we turn to questions, is the growing sophistication of the Arab population. And we talked about this a little bit in the afternoon, that there is still sometimes this default to, quote, the Arab street, which is a rather demeaning way of putting it. As someone said, it's just rabble waiting to be roused. And not a full recognition that with media, education, and a number of other things, it is a very sophisticated market now, and we need to engage with it on that level.
Taking it seriously.
I
think a good comparison would be, when people are frustrated with your policies over many years, and you go and you launch public diplomacy with the sense that we're very good, there's nothing wrong with us, we're just going to tell them how good we are, and you launch that kind of campaign just to tell people how good you are, people aren't going to take it seriously. Think about what the Saudis did. Right after 9/11, I think a lot of people in America were unhappy to learn some facts about Saudi Arabia. They opened up, about the society itself, the role of women, the fact that the attackers came from Saudi Arabia. The Saudis countered with ads in newspapers that were very colorful to essentially to say how good they are and how women have a role. And nobody took that seriously, and they wouldn't take it seriously. So, you've got to take that in mind. But the democracy issue, though, I think it's a little bit different from what you're saying. It's not that on the one hand, they want America to do something about it, on the other hand, they will criticize America. I think they are seeing a reality. When I asked them in the 2004 poll, do you believe that the Middle East is now more democratic or less democratic than before the Iraq War? More people said the Middle East is less democratic than it was before the Iraq War. Now, think about that for a minute. So what's the public seeing? Why is it that they're connecting this in a way to America at the same time that America is advocating democracy? They see a reality. 90% of them passionately opposed the Iraq War. 90% of them believe it went against Arab and Muslim interests or the interests of the states. And even their governments spoke against it and criticized it. And in the end, we went to the governments that are dependent on us and said, we want your support. And they had to make a strategic decision. And almost all of them who were dependent on us, in the end, went along, supported us, provided logistical support and so forth. And they went to do that against their public opinion that was furious with them. And so what did they do?
But doesn't this go to Jaffar's point that it's part of the problem is not a good articulation of shared strategic goals?
Oh, sure.
I think it's... Go ahead.
No, I just want to comment that the one thing that we did not do, we did not ask questions about democratization and whether there is more democratization or less. We asked, because of the United States involvement, is there more or less? And that was the variable. As we found, and you'll see the full PowerPoint, as we found, there were a whole bunch of reforms that were supported in every country. But when we followed it up with, can the United States play a helpful role in assisting, the numbers went right down. And so that just Just, I think, underscores the point.
Well, but the issue is not, we don't want to hear that how much freedom there is in America. The public doesn't want to hear how much democracy there is in America. They know that very well. It's not the issue. When the public in Jordan, for example, is asked about the level of freedom in Jordan or the level of democratization in the country, and to rank it out of 10, along with other countries and what they think the level of democracy is in those countries, the public gives the US, I think, 9 or 10 out of 10, and it gives Jordan a 5. So the public knows there is no problem on the values of the US. They appreciate it. The problem is, what has the US done for the Arab public? At the end of the day, what are the successes, the success stories that the US can come and tell the Arab public that they have given them? Unfortunately, for the Arab public, there are no success stories necessarily. There is a bombing in Baghdad, and there is a shooting in the Palestinian territories. And these have become factors that determine the image of the US foreign policy in the region and what it is doing. So how do you showcase success stories? To do that, you have to support indigenous reform. You have to support at least those who are willing to do true reforms and who are willing to take the necessary changes internally at the level of democratization, at the level of institutional reform, at the level of economic reform that would increase the opportunities, and decrease the insecurities, and make it better for their own populations. This is what the US has to target in order to make success stories. So far, we don't have many.
Okay, this is going to be the last comment, and then we're going to turn it over to questions and answers, which will be done at the mics. So you get the last word on this part.
Oh, just very quickly about the strategic interest that Jafar talked about. I think that because it relates to that point about that there being not enough democracy, lack of democracy in many of these countries, is that what the governments decide is not necessarily what the people want. The strategic policies that the governments make are not taken in consultancy with the people, and they are those strategic policies are in line with America's strategic policies. So.
Okay. We will now open the floor to questions. There are 4 mics, and we're just going to go clockwise. Could you identify yourself and try to keep the question brief? And as they always say, questions end with a question mark. So,
my name is Roy Willie, and my question is: we keep referring to the data.
If you're a student or something, if we.
I'm a student at the college.
Okay.
You keep referring to the data that you showed us as the public opinion of the Middle East, and I'm sure that if you had more time, you probably would have gotten into this. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of time now. Can you tell us about how you went about gathering the data, who you targeted, and how you were sure that you got an accurate representation of the entire public?
Okay, good question. These were several polls, but in a typical poll, what we have done in the interests of time is we have selected key cities in each of the countries. And so in Morocco, for example, Rabat, Fez, Casablanca. In Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria. Simply in the interests of time, you just never would get these done otherwise. And so there is an urban skew to start with. Secondly, in each of the cities, what we've done is we've created 4 quadrants. And within each quadrant, what we've done is we've selected 100+ sample points. Sample points based on, randomly selected, but based on the proper income distribution, so that you wanted to be sure that you got the not simply rich and well-educated, but you also got a smattering of poor. There is an additional skew, and that is not only because it's urban, but also because there are high degrees of illiteracy in many of these countries. They just simply cannot be polled. There are weighting mechanisms that we utilize in order to, weight down the numbers that are more highly educated and weight up those who are less educated, but still it is not an exact, accurate portrayal. Much of the polling that is done in the southern hemisphere is done like that. Now, is it an accurate and representative sampling? I certainly accept that. And among the reasons why is that we get nuanced responses. You know, we had a problem in Egypt, didn't we, a couple of years ago, where our folks went in and did not get permission from the Ministry of Information, went in and did a quick hit and run, and what they did was they selected the wrong sampling points because they were in a hurry. Otherwise, if you wait for permission in Egypt, it could take 3, 4, 5 months, and the rest of the poll has been done much sooner. Point being that if we see some real problems with the responses, then we don't trust the data. I feel that in the numbers of polls that we've done in each of the countries, that we've gotten an adequate enough representation. Not perfect. It's not as perfect, say, as a poll that you can do here in the West by telephone over 2 or 3 days. But even then, we're facing problems here in response rates. I hope that helps.
Yes?
Hi, thank you for being here today. My name is Rami Sarafa. I'm a student at the college. All the panelists mentioned the conflict between Palestine and Israel as sort of telling of Arab opinion in the wider Arab world. However, in the 60s and 70s, the conflict was largely referred to as the Arab-Israeli conflict. However, after the First Intifada, it has largely become referred to as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Although the conflict in many respects has become more localized, there's still implications for the wider Arab world, or at least so you assert. I was wondering if you could elaborate sort of on why general Arab opinion is still sort of bonded to this conflict.
May I, if I may, I have been asking questions about that over the years, and to this date, when you ask them how important the Palestinian-Israeli question to them, majorities of Arabs say that it's the single most important issue to them. Let me interpret that for you. I do not believe the Arab-Israeli issue or the Palestinian-Israeli issue is the source of the troubles we have in the Middle East, or the source of the problems, the reform issues and the political, and even if we resolve it, we still have that challenge. What it is, in my judgment, is the prism through which Arabs see the United States. I call it the prism of pain. I call it the prism of pain because I think every people have a prism of pain through which they look at the world. And I think Americans have a prism of pain today, and that is the prism of 9/11. When they look at Arab and Muslim countries, they're inevitably looking at it through the prism of that attack and the terrorism that's associated with it. Jews have a prism of pain, a deep one, the Holocaust, through which most of them inevitably will look at the world through that prism of pain. Arabs look at the world through that prism of pain. It's an issue of identity. It's an issue of identity in a way that is insensitive to what you see on the media. That is insensitive in terms of their own views. Abortion in America is a question that is somewhat insensitive to what you see on the media. People make up their mind because it's part of who they are. And I think the Arab-Israeli conflict has become that over the years. Every generation of Arabs after World War II has experienced a humiliating war, destruction, defeat, and pain. And it has become a symbol of their humiliation, both in terms of their weakness vis-a-vis the international system and their weaknesses in relation to authoritarian regimes. So for that reason, I think, aside from how we resolve the internal problems in the Arab and Muslim countries, we cannot address the American relationship with the Arab and Muslim countries in a sensible way without paying attention to that prism, which remains the one through which they see America.
You said you had a one-sentence addition?
It's a little long sentence, though. I will defer to Shibley's expertise and eloquence, but in our polling, I would only add that it was upward in the 60s and 70s percentile that said that it was the #1 issue, up into the 80s and 90s percentile who's listed in the top 3 or 4 issues. That included Kuwait, ironically enough. I refer to it, Shibley, I think, accurately calls it the prism of pain. I call it a bloodstream issue. I think it's even beyond a political issue for Arabs and Muslims. I think it just entered into their bloodstream.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
My name is Randall Sarafa. I'm a student at the college. And I know the panel had discussed the media's role in possibly or not possibly forming policy, especially toward the Middle East. And I know it was stated that the media is more of a reflector rather than a former of policy. But I guess then I ask, with the increase in 30-second sound bites and things like this and the lack of in-depth investigative reports with the media and the general population drawing some sort of opinion towards a topic from these 30-second clips, and government officials and politicians responding to their constituents' opinions, then wouldn't it be viable to say that the media is somewhat of a former of policy, just using the general population as sort of a segue to, I guess, manipulate or create new policy?
I can tell you that in my own surveys with Zogby in the Middle East, I have really traced the question of whether there is a statistically significant relationship between what people watch and their opinions on some issues. And one of those issues was attitudes toward the United States. I could tell you that in my forthcoming book, I have the finding, which is there's no statistically significant relationship between what people watch and their attitudes on some of those core issues. The reason for it is very simple. It's not because the media isn't important. The media is extremely important. It's important because it does help shape identity, and we see that in the Middle East. It's important because it gives you information. It's important on secondary issues, but not on core issues. Because core issues, people make up their mind on basis of other things. In fact, we find that when you ask people if they rank an issue high in their priorities, if an issue is extremely important to you, and we ask people, do you get the information on this issue from the media? People mostly say no, because they get it from other sources, because they have a pre-existing view on that issue. On secondary issues, yes. If you ask them, if they have a relationship they trust, if you listen to NPR and you think it reflects your views on the core issues that you believe in, and therefore you have a trusting relationship with it, then what NPR tells you about an issue you don't know anything about, like Nicaragua or some other country, you will trust that information. It becomes an important source for you. But otherwise, it doesn't matter. And if you look actually at our own elections, I mean, think about the 2004 election. It's stunning, because you had between 2000 and 2004, we had the 9/11 attacks, we had the war in Afghanistan, we had the war in Iraq, we had a divided polity, we had debates, we had painful argument for and against, and then we have the results, and the results are largely blue is blue and red is red, as if nothing had happened in between with some minor differences. It's an issue of identity on core questions. We have to come to grips with it.
In fact, it has leveled the ground in a way, because if you look at the media in the Arab world in the 60s or even in the 70s, it was pretty much government propaganda. At least today, the media might still look biased, depending where you stand, but it's come more to the center, even if relatively speaking. The other side of the coin that one should also address is the US media. And maybe not the media as in the news agencies, but the media also as in the movie industry. I watched a presentation last week by a gentleman who did a book on Hollywood and the attitudes in Hollywood movies towards the Arab world. It turned out that in more than 95% of the movies produced in the past 50 years that have any kind of reference to Arabs, the reference is negative. In more than 95%. There is a problem here as well. It's not just on the other side.
Yeah, I'd just actually add to that, and I agree with you completely. Media is not just television and newspapers. I think that if we broaden it, you do look at perceptions that are shaped through the popular cinema, for example, which does. But again, I don't know. This is a very interesting question of how much of it people actually internalize. You mentioned that people don't really shape their opinions according to what they see in the media, but then that's where they get the information from. So it is, and what information is presented and how it is presented is also, I think, a factor. I don't think it's not black and white. It's so simple.
But people go to the media outlets that reinforce their views much more. They skip the ones that go against them.
But I think Jeffrey's point, there is something also in the popular culture that people don't necessarily, you do pick your movies on the kind you like, but if almost every movie that at least has somebody who is Arab or Islamic has it negative, that is sort of somewhere in there. You know, African Americans in this country, you know, are still deeply angry about the way that they were portrayed, you know, for decades. And how you are portrayed both influences how you see yourself and how you think others will see you.
If there are counter images, there's a difference. And there are plenty of African Americans out there to counter those. Now. Yeah.
Now, that's what I said, but it was for them to be able to get away from those stereotypes to a broader one. We haven't quite done that, but we hurt ourselves too, because the kind of popular culture that we send overseas to represent us is often fairly stereotypic and cartoonish too. And we don't help ourselves with what we send overseas.
Chuck Norris in the mid-'80s, when he took off the whole PLO in Beirut, was not something that was digested well in the Arab world at the time, and it was a movie that spread throughout the Arab world. So
no, I was in Yemen when Rules of Engagement came out, and it took me forever to get through the point that this was a movie, it was fiction. I then, about a year or so later, I ended up in Los Angeles, and I actually ended up having lunch with the producer, and kind of pointed out that this movie had really skewed the conversation in the country for a very long time. And it was like, well, that was just a movie. It was just a movie. It was fantasy. I said, no, you portrayed it as a country. You portrayed it as a sort of semi-documentary. And the way it was received overseas, and also the way that, you know, the guys watching it in the theater, they're going to think that there is something accurate and truthful about this. And there was a complete disconnect about the impact and the responsibility of the movie. It was just a movie, and they made the bad guys Yemenis because they had heard of them, but they didn't know anything about them, so it was okay. That's what it kind of came down to. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I'm Richard Sobel, and I do research on public opinion and foreign policy, and the members of the panel's work I particularly admire. Two questions, one domestic and one international. To what extent do you think the declining support for the Iraq War is currently affecting policy, or what levels would it have to decline to have that impact? And internationally, does the U.S. government look at international opinion essentially for public diplomacy reasons to try to sell the policy, or is there some international impact on the policy process?
It's really a good question, and I recall, I could tell you an interesting episode when the first Commission on Public Diplomacy after 9/11 I served on before the administration's commission was the Council on Foreign Relations Commission. When we went to meet with the White House. We did meet with high-level officials, including at the time then National Security Advisor Condi Rice, but we also met with Karl Rove. And it was kind of interesting because we obviously from the point of view of Karl Rove as a domestic advisor, it was a problem to learn that people thought badly of American foreign policy. And he was very interested in looking at the evidence. I think in the end, there's been a consequence for American foreign policy, but that consequence has not been directly a function of the discovery that public opinion didn't like American foreign policy, but it was mostly a function of the entanglement in Iraq and therefore the souring of American public opinion on the Iraq War in a way that has limited the options. I think one of the surprises for the administration was that rather than empowering American foreign policy, the Iraq War has weakened American foreign policy, and that has in a way forced far more multilateral efforts, the likes of which we see vis-a-vis Iran, and has limited the military option considerably in the short term, both from the point of view of actual resources that are now spent in Iraq, and the point of view of the American public's willingness to support those enterprises. And in that sense, it has had a major impact on American foreign policy.
There's two elements of public opinion that are very important in terms of their impact on policy, and I want to address it domestically. The one is you know, the frequency, the majority. And clearly the majority is against the war. It's almost unanimous among Democrats. It's very large among independents. And it's growing among the president's conservative base. But there are two other elements that are very important. The other is intensity. And which side is the intensity on? Right now, there may be 35, 36% who support the war. They are very intense in their support. The intensity against the war was developing during the summer. And that brought in the additional element of a person, a focal point, Mrs. Sheehan, Cindy Sheehan. Very important then for supporters of the war to go all out to destroy her because she was helping achieve critical mass. What diverted attention away from the war, obviously, were the hurricanes after that. However, I think you will come to a point where the intensity against the war will only grow because problems on the ground continue, but there will still be another element missing, and that is a Democratic Party and leading Democratic spokespersons who have the guts to come out and say, you know what, I made a mistake. I think this is wrong. And until somebody does that, like a Tip O'Neill did in 1966, like a Bobby Kennedy did in 1967, like a Martin Luther King did in 1966, until you see that, important people changing their minds, I don't think you're going to get much of a change.
Henry Daher, I'm a visitor. My question is about Lebanon, is another country in the Middle East where since 1 year, since the assassination of the Prime Minister, a lot's been going on, withdrawal of the Syrian forces, new government, setting up an investigation team, international investigation team for the Prime Minister. It's all being labeled in the American media and American government as bringing democracy to the Middle East and hopefully rolling on this model to other countries. So I would like to take your opinion on what's going on there, and aside from the media, I would like to hear what you want to say about that.
I'd be glad to give you my opinion for what it's worth. First of all, I think the Syrian withdrawal clearly was a function of Lebanese rallying above all, because in fact you had major constituents in Lebanon that came together in ways we hadn't seen across sectarian lines because of who Hariri was. And that, of course, was galvanized support that was already there. There was already frustration with the Syrian presence in Lebanon. It's not that it wasn't there, but it galvanized the support, despite the fact that Syria did have important allies who did demonstrate significant power, political power, not just military power, Hezbollah particularly, but a significant Shia constituency that was Syria's ally and remains Syria's allies in Lebanon. But that coming together was significant. The second thing is that while people credit American foreign policy, and clearly the US did play a role, in the end, the Syrians backed down because you had the UN resolution, especially backed by France. Europe was on board of that one. The Syrians could have withstood, I think, American pressure if, in fact, they had the Europeans on their side and the Arab governments on their side. I think in the end that was the tipping point. And I think if you want to make a case for why the Syrians would have an interest in removing Hariri out of the way, probably the single most important issue that led to France taking that position was Hariri and his relationship with Chirac. And in that sense, I think he was singularly thought to have accounted for the UN resolution that in the end forced them to pull back. And I think in that sense, there is that. I worry about Lebanon. I think it's a great country with fabulous potential, energetic people, but sectarianism is not dead in Lebanon. And today, there is a vacuum of power. There is no central government. It is still dependent on the outside world. And what will come of it, I don't know. This is not a democracy in the way I would like to see democracy, because the system as it is defined is still defined along sectarian lines in a troubling way, both in terms of the moral position that we take on what democracy is, and also in terms of the conditions that may once again engender sectarian conflict.
And I would not also extend it to the rest of the Middle East. This is not a domino effect where this is the first or second domino falling down. It is a really limited thing, and the Syrian military presence there had a lot to do with the actual masses coming up, which is something you would not necessarily have in other Arab countries.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good evening. My name is Joss Gossman. I'm a student at Wellesley. Recently, in recent years, the term Arab American has been heard a lot more often and kind of been used easily as other groups, African Americans, Cuban Americans, and the such. Do you think that the term Arab American came up as a way of identifying Americans by people that had a negative stereotype with them, or by the Arabs themselves trying to identify themselves as American, and that the other people, they weren't extremists?
Okay.
The first wave of Arab immigration to the United States before World War II involved 95% Christian, 90% Lebanese, 10% Syrian, very little of anyone else. And very, very importantly, many of those Lebanese and Syrians identified themselves by village or by confession. After 1967, 67 war was galvanizing for Arab Americans in a number of ways. Number one, it brought in new immigrants and a diversity of immigrants. It brought in a more pan-Arab view of things. It brought in more Muslims. And in terms of just the history of American immigration, by the 70s and by the 80s, you now had third generation born American, very comfortable in their American identity, no longer needing to prove who they were, and hence very comfortable in joining Arab American organizations. But policy and defamation were very, very important in terms of galvanizing all of these other strands that came together.
Yes?
Yeah, Syed from Pakistan. My question concerns the core issue of the Palestinian-Israeli issue and certain perceptions in the Islamic world on that issue. Hardly a day goes by in America when one doesn't hear some politician somewhere professing his undying love for Israel. And then we have the televangelists trying to convince us 24/7 that support for Israel is sort of like the 11th commandment. So looking at it from the outside, I see it seems to me that the Democrats and there's some sort of competition going on between the Democrats and the Republicans on who can show more fealty to Israel. So my question to really is that with this backdrop of unquestioning and blind support for Israel, where anyone who says one word in favor of the Palestinian cause, he is virtually writing his political obituary and is branded anti-Semitic. So with this sort of a backdrop, is it possible for the US government to act with neutrality and fairness and justice?
Well, actually, it's really interesting to look at this historical perspective. Because, as I said before, I think the perceptions of American bias on this issue are not new. They've been there in America. In Arab and Muslim countries have seen that throughout, and they've been essentially accusing the U.S. of bias, and certainly that and double standards on that issue. In some regards, that's not new, although the degree to which this administration got involved, particularly during the intense conflict between Israel and Palestinians, became much more of a visible problem for the administration. But I think it's very important to look at both how Arabs in general, I don't know about Muslims in general, but certainly Arabs in general have dealt with it, and contrasting different policies of the United States of America, even while it was being accused of bias on the Arab-Israeli issue. Think Clinton. Clinton certainly was accused, initially was accused of being the most pro-Israel president ever. I mean, look at the literature, even here in America, early on. By the time he made Arab-Israeli peacemaking his #1 priority and went to Gaza and expressed empathy with the Palestinians without undermining his support for Israel, the trend changed. That is why in 2000, when the State Department pulled in Saudi Arabia and asked people, do you have confidence in the United States of America? Over 60% of Saudis said they had confidence in the United States of America. They may not have liked American foreign policy, still believed it was biased. What has happened now is that people have two fears. One fear is that the administration doesn't care at all about resolving it. This is not a priority issue and in fact, I think the frustration with the Iraq war, people said, if you want to get rid of Saddam, fine, but first deal with this problem. And they saw it as coming at the expense of dealing with this problem, that you're putting all these energies, all this moral authority that you had after 9/11 behind an issue that wasn't at the core of their concerns. And so in the end, that was the problem. Now the evangelical issue is a problem because now they might think, unfortunately, that the support is based on some kind of a religious belief. And we're trying to untangle that actually in the current survey. I have a specific question designed to tease that out in terms of what they think American objectives are.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Jared Safran. I'm a freshman at Harvard College. How important is it for Israel to pay attention to opinion polls in the Palestinian territories and the greater Arab world in moving towards a greater peace process?
Well, first of all, everyone should always pay attention to polls. Polls are a good thing. Public opinion doesn't drive policy and probably shouldn't drive policy, but no nation, no leadership can afford in any way to be totally contemptuous of the public. And so, I mean, I think it's very, very important that Israel, like any other, that the leadership of Israel, like the leadership of any other nation, pay some sort of attention to what's going on. To answer the previous question, and maybe this might help a little bit, there also is the intensity of public opinion. And one of the reasons why there has been an imbalance is that Jewish American public opinion, while very liberal on many issues, call it Land for Peace or Madrid or Oslo or Roadmap or all that, two-state solution, always been supportive, if not a majority, then a clear plurality. It is the high-intensity opponents, the high-intensity ultra-conservatives that make their voices heard and that almost force politicians to stand up and obey. That's the answer to your question. And to yours, I mean, are you implying then that the public be damned and that the leadership do whatever it sees in its own interest?
Not the public of Israel, more like the public of Palestine. For Israel, specifically with regards to something like the security wall, for them to pay attention to polls in Palestine that show, I don't know, like 90% of the Palestinians opposed to a policy.
I've
Do they
polled
need to be more
Israel a
responsive?
lot. I've polled Israel a lot. And I mean, I would just throw this back on you. I would ask one very simple question every day. Is this what you want?
So go ahead, sorry.
It would also depend, I mean, on the elasticity or the reaction, each government, how it reacts to its own public opinion. In certain cases, public opinion polls would not matter much to certain governments, depending on the system within which they operate. In the case of the Palestinian Authority today, I believe there is relatively high sensitivity to the beat of the street. where it would be lacking in other parts of the region. So from this perspective, yes, the Israelis should be concerned about the beat of the street in the Palestinian territories. But ironically, the Israelis might be more sensitive to the beat of the street in Europe than they would be to the beat of the street in most Arab countries, simply because that would affect European policy making more than it would perhaps affect actual Arab policy making when it comes to Israeli interests.
Now, wasn't it the Israeli foreign minister who recently said that the most important public opinion for Israel is in America?
Probably.
I think
I hadn't
somebody
heard that,
just quoted that the other
yeah.
day. But I just wanted to add a little bit about the media. What was said here is that, for example, that the public opinion does not drive policy, but it should be taken into account. But then you come back to the media, and how much does the media of the information does the media give to the public to allow them to form their opinions to, you know, pressurize? For example, the war on Iraq, going in there for weapons of mass destruction, which everybody knows now is completely a falsehood, which I think a lot of the media also, if they had played their role responsibly as questioned the authorities or the administration, as the media should, might have, you know, given out a different picture before the war, and there might have been significantly more public opinion against going into Iraq right at the outset, as you're seeing now, when the truth is coming out. So I think that, again, it comes back to the question of what comes out in the media.
Okay, this is the last question.
Okay, well, I'm Martin Frost. I'm a fellow at the Institute of Politics and a former congressman. Two things. First of all, I think John Zogby is a terrific pollster, and but I have a question for him. And second,
I asked the question.
And excuse me.
I asked the question.
Oh no. And secondly, I'm not a big fan of President Bush's, but let me. I'm concerned about one thing you said at the beginning of your presentation, that there were 4 problems for the United States in the Arab world, and one of them was Bush's statement about Sharon being a peacekeeper, a big
Man of
peacekeeper.
peace.
Man of peace.
Yeah. Does Sharon get any credit in the Arab world for the fact that he has gone against elements of his own party in trying to make any progress, and specifically on Gaza, in dealing with the Palestinians, or does he get no credit for that at all?
You know, I have not measured that recently. I would only assume no, that it's public opinion towards a figure like Sharon is not that nuanced. But let me go back to when the statement was made, in the context of when the statement was made in early 2002, and the impact was electric. Should we?
Yeah,
is it not?
There's no question. It was in the context, but I do have a question right now in the field, specifically on how people interpret the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and I give them all sorts of possible answers, good and bad, to see where they are, whether they give Sharon any credit at all or not. We'll find out. But I could tell you, just aside from what I'm likely to find in my polling, the vast majority of people do not give him credit because they see this as a strictly unilateral Israeli attempt. It didn't come out as an agreement, as a consequent agreement. He declared it to Israelis in terms of maximizing Israeli security, minimizing the burden. And many Palestinians believe that and many Arabs believe that Israel had never had really ambitious claims toward Gaza, but mostly toward the West Bank. And this is done in conjunction with an attempt to maintain more of the West Bank. So they don't give him credit for that. I mean, that's the basic interpretation. But I'm not assuming that in my polling, because I give him all kinds of options to choose from to see whether it tease it out.
Even though he will get a challenge from the right in his own party, for
Yes.
leadership of his own party, because he did this.
They still don't see that as, I mean, they don't give him credit for acting even in his own self-interest, which is not what politicians usually do. That is in the country's interest. I mean, that is to have the courage to act in the country's national interest, which he did. Politicians usually don't.
I think the short version of the concern is that it's not Gaza first, it's Gaza only. And if that's the case, then he's not going to get very many points for it, because it is not on the road to peace. It was really a detour.
And to whose advantage, at the end of the day, is the result of this? true, there will be a lot of advantages for the Palestinians in Gaza, but in the final analysis, isn't it partly what Sharon always wanted? And the other side would tell you, well, he had to withdraw because Hamas were attacking, and it was a way to, which is, I'm not saying that this is the case, but this is how it would be interpreted by many in the public.
Okay, one thing I do know about debates that have to do with, or amongst this part of the world, it could probably go on for hours, days, months, even years. But unfortunately, this forum can't continue much longer. I'm getting this kind of sign from the guys in the back. So, excuse me, I'd like to thank all of you for coming, for being a good audience with good questions, and good night.